Well, hello, and thank you for being with us for our service today. My name is Matt, and I've been a part of the Beacon Church now for the last 14 years. And I've got some big news to share with you from my life. I had my first vaccine last Wednesday. I received my text message the Friday before. So great was my excitement that I let out an audible yes, much to the confusion of the colleagues of mine who I was in a meeting with at the time. But for me, they asked me what the news was about. They were curious as to why I was so excited. And I was able to tell them that I was about to get my jab next week. And they were somewhat underwhelmed by the news, and we continued with the meeting as if kind of nothing had happened. But for me, my excitement was real, because I have a wedding coming up in September, and I'm hoping to travel to an exotic land for my honeymoon. And while nothing has been said about a vaccine passport, I wanted to make sure I was as prepared as I could be for the future plans that I had, ensuring that they would all fall into place. So I went and I had my jab, thinking nothing more of it. But then, just as the lady had told me, I had some of the side effects. I was very confident that I'd be totally unaffected, as I'm a fit and healthy young man. But just in time for the bank holiday weekend, and just as the weather seemed to have remembered what time of year it is, I started to feel really unwell. How perfect for me. Something I was so excited about took me by an unexpected surprise, and I started to feel awful for the whole weekend. I even lost my voice entirely last Sunday, but thankfully I've recovered, and it's my privilege today to share with you as we continue to look at the life of Joseph from the book of Genesis. If you've been able to join us so far on this journey, then you will have heard and you will have seen last week that Tim Chapman shared about Joseph, who was sold into slavery as a young man, has now been reunited with his family. And that family, he's moved them to the land, which against all the odds, he's risen to a position of prominence. And as his family arrived with all their possessions, during a severe famine at the time, Joseph stands on their behalf as an advocate for them. He stands in front of the Pharaoh, making their case. Tim reminded us that this is a foreshadowing of the work of Jesus many years later. Jesus, who stands on our behalf to save us from a state that was much worse than the one Joseph's family found themselves in. Pharaoh listens to Joseph, and he assigns his family some of the best land in the nation to establish themselves. And Joseph gives them some food to eat, which saves them from the famine that they were facing. We see at the end of chapter 47, it says this: "Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there, and they were fruitful and increased greatly in number. They had found favor in the land of Egypt. Jacob and the Israelites lived and worked there for another 17 years. And then right at the end of chapter 47, we see that Jacob is coming to the end of his life. He summons Joseph and makes him promise to bury him with his fathers in Canaan and not in the land of Egypt, which is where he was. And the chapter ends with Joseph agreeing to do as he was asked. And this could well have been the end of our time with Jacob. But as we pick up the story again in chapter 48, we see Jacob calls Joseph again, but this time his condition is much worse. We read at the start of chapter 48. "Sometime later, Joseph was told, 'Your father is ill.' He took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, along with him. When Jacob was told, 'Your son Joseph has come to you,' Israel rallied his strength and sat up on his bed." It looked like Jacob's story was about to end in chapter 47. But what we're about to see is a number of significant prophetic blessings that Jacob issues to his sons. He starts with Joseph's 2 sons that he adopts as his own. And then in chapter 49, he goes on to give blessings to his remaining sons. These prophetic blessings paint the picture of how God is to establish his people around the world. And it's pointing forward to the 12 tribes of Israel and how they're formed, a tribe from which Jesus was a descendant. So he starts with Joseph. And as was custom at the time, all male heirs went to the deathbeds to receive their blessings. And we see at the very start, Jacob was really poorly. He was at the end of his life. He had to summon all and any strength that he had to sit up in his bed. His body was failing and his eyesight was weak. And he starts off by reminding Joseph of the dreams that he had and a place called Bethel. Now, this was a significant place for Jacob, and it was where he encountered God powerfully on 2 occasions. And on the second visit when he was there, we see that God gives him the name Israel. And we see the name Israel and Jacob used interchangeably as we go through the text. We read of these occasions in chapters 28 and 35 of Genesis. And God is reiterating in these times the promise that he originally gave to Abraham, Jacob's grandfather. That his descendants will be like the dust on the earth, and that there will be a nation and a community of nations that will come from his family line, and that all the people of the world will be blessed by his offspring. It is important that Jacob's heirs know what has been spoken over them as a family. This is God's plan for the redemption of mankind, and Jacob is keen to remind Joseph and his sons of this promise. So let's read from the text from Genesis 48, verses 9 to 14. It says, "Then Israel said, 'Bring them to me so I may bless them.' Now Israel's eyes were failing because of his old age, and he could hardly see. So Joseph brought his sons close to him, and his father kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, 'I never expected to see your face again, and now God has allowed me to see your children too.' Then Joseph removed them from Israel's knees and bowed down with his face on the ground. And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim on his right towards Israel's left, and Manasseh on his left towards Israel's right. And then he brought them close to him. But Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger. And crossing his arm, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, even though Manasseh was the firstborn." So I want to unpack a little bit of what's happening here. Joseph was Jacob's long-lost son, the one he believed he would never see again, and he's brought his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to Jacob's bedside, so that not only they can receive the blessing, but that they can also be adopted by Jacob and placed into the position of sons of Jacob. We see that Joseph calls his son back from the original embrace that Jacob gives them when he greets them, so that he can correctly position them so they receive the blessing. With Ephraim, the younger of the two sons, on his right-hand side, and Manasseh, the firstborn, on his left, Joseph moves them forward. But as he moves them forward, with the older son Manasseh towards Jacob's right, and Ephraim, the younger, towards Jacob's left, we see a bit of an unexpected twist. Because at this time, to be at the right hand of someone was seen to be the power position. So because of this, the right hand carries the greater of the blessings, which is reserved for the firstborn. And we've seen in the life of Jacob previously the significance of a firstborn blessing. Joseph's positioning of his sons is really significant here. And as I said, it doesn't quite go to plan. As Jacob reaches out his hands to bless the two sons, he crosses them over and he places his right hand on the head of Ephraim, the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, the firstborn. As Joseph sees this, he tries to swap the hands over, saying, "Father, this is the firstborn, he should receive the greater blessing." Jacob's response is very simple. He says, "I know, my son, I know." And here's a key lesson that we can learn from the story. God has a plan, he knows the plan, and he will complete the plan. Joseph thinks that he's made a mistake, and he tries to correct Jacob. He tries to interfere, but his response, as we've seen, is simple: "I know what I'm doing." Interestingly, in verse 5, we see Jacob refer to Joseph's sons in reverse order as he asks for them to be brought to himself. It says this: "Now then, your two sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine." Jacob says the name of the younger son first as he calls them for the blessing. We can see from the very outset it was Jacob's intention to flip the order and give the firstborn blessing to the firstborn blessing to the younger son. Jacob knows how God works. Jacob knows that God is often going against the cultural grain to use the lesser to fulfill his promises. Jacob's poor eyesight to Joseph is the obvious excuse for the mistake, but it becomes a lesson for us all about trusting God when things don't really make sense to us. Joseph just assumed that his dad couldn't see, but Jacob could see better than anybody else in the room at that time. He saw how God saw. There is no mistake here. No matter how much it might look like one, God had a plan, and he will ensure that it happens. And we see this time and time again in the Bible, that God chooses to shake up the conventional order and uses people that the world wouldn't expect to fulfill his plans. Whether that be a younger sibling, the unimpressive, or even the outcast. We have seen that God chose Abel and not Cain. He chose Isaac, not Ishmael, and he chose Jacob, not Esau. David was the smallest and the youngest of all the brothers, but he was the one chosen to defeat the giant Goliath. When Gideon came to God with an army of 32,000 to face the Midianites, God said to him, no, 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 that's too many. Let's try 300. And then we go to the New Testament. We see Jesus, who called the fishermen and the tax collectors. He associated with the politically isolated and the sexually immoral. There is a pattern throughout Scripture, and this text is highlighting it for us. That when things around us look like they aren't what they should be, when the order seems to have been mistaken, can we celebrate and find comfort in the fact that God is in control? At this moment, Jacob was fully aware of what he was doing. Where previously in his life, he might not have been able to see the hand of God at work. But he had come to an understanding of God's sovereign plan, and he is determined to pass this on. On his deathbed, we see Jacob's actions as an intentional faith lesson for Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh are definitely more Egyptian than anybody else in their family. They have been apart from Jacob and the rest of the tribe all of their life. Joseph's sons will have been born in Egypt to an Egyptian mother. They will have been the least familiar with the promises spoken over this family. This is likely to be Jacob's final opportunity to influence, to shape, and to direct his offspring. And Jacob wants to leave them with the promises, the beliefs, and the hopes that he's been given by his forefathers and by their God. Egypt isn't their home, and the gods of Egypt are definitely not their God. And Jacob's intentional about telling them about who God is. As he blesses the sons, Jacob refers to God who has been his shepherd all the days of his life. Verse 15 says this, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all the days of my life." He refers to God as a shepherd, and this is the first time in Scripture that we see God being called a shepherd. Jacob will have been very much aware of what this means. He will have known firsthand what this means to be a shepherd, as he was one himself. He will also, in turn, have known what it means to have been a sheep in this story as well. And only now he can see himself in the position of sheep. The shepherd is the protector, the provider, and without the shepherd watching and protecting, the sheep will find itself lost and in danger. We often see the cute picture of a shepherd carrying a lost sheep back to the flock over his back, holding his legs tight. And while this may look triumphant, this is because even though the sheep was in danger, when the shepherd comes to rescue, the sheep still doesn't understand. The sheep will continue to jump, and it will try to run around, and it will often hurt itself more. Jacob can now see that in times of his life, he was like the sheep. And this is a picture that he's trying to leave with his sons. One of a shepherd who protects, one of a shepherd who looks after, even when the sheep might be confused. His own life has been a story of not understanding that he has a God who's protecting him all the time and is with him all the time. But as he reflects now, he sees clearly. He wants to ensure that he passes on these final words of wisdom to his family, that they know the goodness and the protection of a God in times of hardship. But Jacob's life wasn't easy. He was born to a father who didn't love him. He had a broken relationship with his brother and was forced to flee for his life. Then he was forced to work for a future father-in-law, only to be tricked into marrying someone who he didn't love. And then eventually, he married the woman he did love, only to lose her a few short years later in childbirth. And to top this all off, he lost his favorite son, who he thought he would never see again. Jacob might not have always seen the big picture of what God was doing, and the choices he made might not have always been wise. But as he reflects, he's sure to pass on the fact that God was with him through all the good and all the bad. I wonder, are you going through a situation right now? Do you have a broken family relationship? Have you experienced loss? Can I encourage you today that God knows your situation, and he says to you, I'm still in control, and you will get through this. When we saw Jacob arrive in Egypt and was about to be introduced to the Pharaoh, all his reflections were that his life to that point had been few years, of difficulty. But as we fast forward to his deathbed reflections, he speaks of God's provision and God's protection. There was a man who experienced his fair share of hardship, but as he reflects on his life and the final messages that he chooses to impart to his sons are ones of the goodness of God. Jacob looked at his life in his final moments with a very different perspective than when he first arrived in Egypt. He can see that his life was not one sequence of trauma after trauma, but a chain of events in the sovereign plan of God to accomplish his purposes. Now, I can only imagine that if we would have so much more joy if we could come to the same conclusion that Jacob did. But can I challenge us? Shall we try and do this before Jacob did? Let's not wait until the end of our life to understand that God is there and God is with us. We cannot ignore suffering, and nor should we go out of our way to seek it. But when it comes, let's savor in the light of how beautifully God can use it to bring us to an intimacy with him. When knowing God is ultimately good, suffering is not too high a price to pay to be in a relationship with him. We have seen this worked out in the life of Joseph in these last few weeks. He has shown us what it means to savor and to seek God in difficult times. Maybe then we can also learn to rejoice in our difficulties as Joseph did, knowing that God is at work maturing us and teaching us about endurance. We might not always understand why or how things are happening to us. And if right now you're hearing this and you're in the middle of a storm, or you feel maybe you've fallen too far off of the plan that God has for you, and that you can no longer be a part of what God is doing, then be encouraged today. That we can see that God does not choose us because of our potential or our abilities. And he doesn't exclude us because of our failures and our weaknesses. Let's learn to trust God in times of hardship. Trying to not fix things on our own, in our own strength, but instead believing that he still has a purpose for our life, even when we may have fallen short. And if you're going through something tough, know that God can still use your story and can still use those circumstances for something good. While it might have been a silly example, just like I had some unexpected and what I felt undeserved suffering as a result of my vaccination, and my bank holiday plans had been disturbed and I didn't quite have the fun that I was anticipating, my ultimate plan of an exotic holiday in September is still on track. I know that ultimately that jab is there for my good, and in the big picture, my suffering was well worth it. So what do you think we can take away from this passage? Firstly, let's be encouraged that even if we're in the middle of a storm, God has shown and he has promised that he will be right there with us. Secondly, if you think the life you've lived up to this point may have somehow disqualified you from playing a key role in the mission of God, then know that if you acknowledge that you've missed the mark, God is faithful to forgive, and he will use your life for his purposes. And lastly, if you think of yourself as not impressive enough, or if you look different to everybody else that you see around you, and you may have ruled yourself out from ever being used by God, then let me encourage you today. You are in good company. The Bible is full of heroes who have messed up or who the world might have seen as unimpressive or have even rejected. And as Tim reminded us last week, the life of Joseph and all that we've been studying and the entire Old Testament is just pointing us forward to something greater, to a man who was born in a place that people believed nothing good could ever come from. He worked an ordinary, normal job for the majority of his life, and he was rejected by those who loved him and cared for him. Does that sound like somebody you can relate to? Well, Psalm 118 says this: the stone that was rejected has now become the cornerstone. Jesus, who was rejected, became the most significant person in all of history. Because he died and because of his resurrection, we can know this good shepherd, the one who protects and the one who has a plan for our life. Tim is now going to lead us in a bit more time of worship where we're just going to celebrate who Jesus is. Maybe you could use this time to look back on your life as Jacob did and thank God that he's been with you. Or maybe if you're struggling and you can't see God in your circumstance, can I encourage you during this time of worship to lift your gaze to an almighty God who is there and is your protection? Jane is going to help us respond to some of these things after the time of worship, but I'm just going to hand over to Tim and the band.